Hello class, welcome to our second part of our lesson for section 2.2, which deals with finding trig functions of angles that are not acute, so that's probably a bigger than 90 degree, or it could be a negative angle as well. Today we're going to be dealing with questions like we ended with the last class period. Remember, the directions are important here. They want you to find answers from 0 to 360. And anytime you're answering for 0 to 360, there's typically going to be two answers because there's two parts around the circle where trig functions are positive or negative. So I think your rule of thumb is the following. This one says find sine of theta if it's negative root 3 over 2. So notice that this is a negative, and sine is negative in quadrants 3 and 4. So just using the all students take calculus, 3 and 4. And then one option is you could just make a triangle every time. The other option is you could use your 45, 45, 90 and 30, 60, 90 with SOHCAHTOA. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so the opposite has to be root 3 and the hypotenuse has to be 2. That should correspond to a 1 here and a 60-degree angle because it's opposite of the root 3, which means my reference angle then is 60 degrees. That's the whole key to the question. If you learn something with the unit circle, it does a similar thing to this. I just think this might help you when you get further along in the sections. So your answer has to be in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, and just with a 60-degree reference angle. So in quadrant 3, it's 180 plus 60, which is 240. And in quadrant 4, it's 360 minus 60, which is 300. And those are your two answers. You can always check and see if those answers are right, because when you plug in 240 for sine, if you take sine of 240, you should get this answer. Same thing with 300. Okay, the next question starts with cosecant. SOHCAHTOA works well for sine, cosine, tangent. So the suggestion would probably be, instead of having it set up this way, just make it sine. Just do the reciprocal. And here's a little hint. If there's a root 2 in the question and it's an exact value question, it's going to be a 45-degree reference angle because a 1 root 2 triangle is the only option for a square root of 2. If cosecant is negative, so is sine. And so those two things are negative in quadrants 3 and 4. So I have a 45-degree reference angle in quadrant 3. 180 plus 45 is 225. And in quadrant 4, 360 minus 45 is 315. Again, the goal is figure out where it's positive, negative, figure out the reference angle, and then put that reference angle in the two quadrants that work, and then find your angles. It's a pretty straightforward process once you get the hang of it. So just make sure you're working on getting the hang of where things are positive, where things are negative, what reference angle, etc. Next one is cotangent is negative 1. Remember, that's 1 over negative 1 or vice versa. If you flip it, it's still negative 1. Tangent and cotangent are negative in quadrants 2 and 4, okay, positive in 1 and 3. And this one's normally a tricky one for students. Notice here I don't care about the negative sign. I'm just going to figure out, well, what ratio is 1 over 1? Well, 1 and 1 for opposite and adjacent using SOHCAHTOA. Okay, opposite and adjacent are 1, which means this has to be root 2. And again, it's a 45-degree reference angle, but I need it to be in quadrant 2 and quadrant 4. Quadrant 4 is pretty easy. 360 minus 45 is 315. Quadrant 2 is actually the exact same, just with 180. So 180 minus 45 is 135. Notice, two answers around the circle where it works. The next question is secant equals, secant of theta equals negative 2. I don't know a whole lot about secant, so I just make it cosine. Cosine is negative 1/2, and that's in quadrants 3 and 4 because it's positive in 1 and 4. Or I'm sorry, positive in 1 and 4, so your answers are negative in 2 and 3. The important thing is cosine is adjacent, so if this would be my angle, adjacent is 1, hypotenuse is 2. Notice I don't care about the negative sign right now. I'm just figuring out what the ratios are. That corresponds to an opposite side of root 3. And it's going to be those two triangles that we started memorizing the other day. So in this case, opposite of root 3 is 60, so your reference angle has to be 60 degrees. In quadrant 2, that is found by taking 180 minus 60, and in quadrant 3, that's found by taking 180 plus 60, and you get these two answers of 120 and 240. Again, focus on the ratio. Don't worry about the negative in terms of the ratio. Just figure out the reference angle, and then deal with the positive negatives for the quadrants. Next question is cosecant is negative 1. That corresponds to sine being negative 1. If I'm just going through this process the same as the other one, sine should be negative in 3 and 4. The problem is when you make a triangle, it's basically saying the opposite has to be 1 and the hypotenuse is 1. And that's a problem because the opposite should be shorter than the hypotenuse. If you ever get sine or cosine or their reciprocals as 1, 0, things like that, it's got to be one of these 4 quadrantial angle spots. And it's this one down here because the opposite or the y value is negative 1 divided by r, which is 1. You could find it that way from this from this picture. You could also find it by the sine graph. I like using the sine graph sometimes because it dictates it a little bit differently. So if it was 90, it would have been 1. So 270 is the only answer. This is one of the few cases where you won't have two answers. The important thing to realize is there really are two answers here. They just happen to be both 270 because the idea is it's on this quadrant, on this line between the quadrants. So the answer just happens to be both the same because the reference angle is kind of nothing at that point. So this is the one case when sine and cosine or those things end up being 1 or -1. That's probably the only spot where you'll get one answer, not two. You could use the circle idea, the unit circle piece, or you could use the graph of sine to help with that answer. Any of those options should be good in order to figure that out. What I have left here on this slide is just 4 questions to try out. No matter where you're at looking at this information, you can try these out. These first 2, I'll tell you, work out pretty nicely in terms of the triangles. These last 2 are more quadrantial because you notice it's cosine is -1 and sine is 0. Those are those 90-degree angle looking spots. Once you try them and find the answer, you can always check your answer by plugging it in for theta. For example, if you get sine of a number, whatever answer you get, plug it in, you should get 1/2. Whatever answer you get for this cosine theta equals -1, plug it into a calculator, you should get -1. Just a quick reminder about calculators. I know many of you will be using the online one for what you can. When we look at the next lesson, though, we're going to need some things with some scientific calculators that really the one online can't do very well. So you're going to have to find a scientific calculator, I think, in order to kind of move through some of these questions and to be successful. So if you don't have a scientific calculator, you need one of some type as you're looking at the next section. So keep that in mind. Try to find one. Because we need to look at some things with angles, and it should make your life a lot easier when it comes to some of the questions with things like degrees, minutes, seconds. Have a good day, everybody.